Welcome back to the Sabbath at Midnight. Tonight, we have a special guest, Dr. Richard Gallagher, author of the book, Demonic Foes. And this is going to be a very interesting topic on possession and oppression. And Dr. Gallagher will go into the nuances of the psychiatric part regarding various abnormalities when it goes to cognitive psychoses and the like. Dr. Gallagher, can you introduce yourself to the audience and let them know where to find your book and anything else you want to add?
Yeah, sure. My name is Dr. Richard Gallagher. I'm a board-certified psychiatrist and professor of psychiatry in New York. I'm also the longest-standing American member of a group called the International Association of Exorcists. I'm not an exorcist myself, but I do scientific consultations and evaluations of people who are suspected of possibly having demonic attack, although some of them are medically or mentally ill. So because of all my experience in the last 25 years or so, I wrote a book that I was encouraged to write to give a sort of manual how to do what I do, as well as a lot of examples of cases I've dealt with. It's called Demonic Foes. A psychiatrist investigates possession, diabolic attacks, and the paranormal, or what I would call the so-called paranormal that preoccupies a lot of people. And it's very easily available. I mean, the easiest way, as with most books, is just to get it through Amazon. I do recommend the Audible version, which is narrated by a friend of mine who's a Shakespearean actor, and he does a fabulous job. Mm-hmm. But it's also available in hardcover and paperback. You can get it through HarperCollins, which is the publishing company directly, but a lot of people just find it easiest to get it on Amazon.
Yeah, absolutely. I found my copy at Barnes & Noble, so you can also get it there. Really quick.
You found it in Barnes & Noble?
Yeah, I got a copy at Barnes & Noble's. It was the only one left, so I was pretty happy that I snagged the last one.
Yeah, it's selling pretty well. It's kind of a bestseller. It has been translated into several different languages, including Japanese, because this topic is very popular in the Far East as well.
Oh, yeah.
And it's also been translated into Polish, and there's a Spanish version as well.
So, Dr. Gallagher, so I read most of your book, pretty much all of it, and I wanted to, if it was okay, if we can get into this very interesting person by the name of Julia. I mean, she has a lot of feats that are very interesting, from remote viewing, being able to levitate, and all that. Call herself the Lilith and stuff like that. If I would like to get into that, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Can you give us?
It was a very interesting. Do you want me to just get into it?
Oh, yeah. However you want, sir. However you want.
Yeah. Just go into the, the story, the beginning, how you met her, if there's any environmental background, and how it progressed through your sessions.
Well, I'd had several years of experience dealing with demonically attacked cases by that point. I'd originally been consulted by a priest exorcist in my area. I always tell people I never really volunteered for this. I just got asked, as a practicing Christian and Catholic, I got asked as a academic psychiatrist to get involved in this field. And, as a physician, I deal with suffering people. So this was kind of a unique situation to be able to help some people who were suffering greatly. I mean, even if they were mistaken and were mentally ill. But about 2 years after getting started with this sort of work, there was a priest who wanted me to meet a woman that in the book I call Julia. That's not her real name. Every fact in the book I wrote, Demonic Foes, every fact is 100% accurate. In other words, I don't take any liberties, except that I disguise the identity a little bit of the person, and I give them a different name. But I met this woman after a strange night in my house, because my wife and I were in a bedroom and we had 2 cats, and the cats used to sleep at the foot of the bed. And all of a sudden, about 3 a.m., they just went berserk. I mean, in a way we'd never seen before and have never seen since. They just started fighting each other, clawing each other. I say in the book, like champion prize fighters. And we were kind of mystified. We thought, maybe they ate some bad food, or maybe they had too much catnip or something. But the very next morning, we separated the cats. They calmed down. The very next morning, this priest, unbeknown to me, because I had never met her before, he brought this Satanist to my house. He wanted me to meet her, which is a little unusual for a doctor.
Yeah.
And I told him, please, Father, don't bring any more Satanists to my neighborhood. And the first thing out of Julia's mouth was, "Hi, Dr. Gallagher. Nice to meet you. I've heard about you. And by the way, how did you like those cats last night?"
Oh, wow.
So, knowing that, other than she obviously had something to do with it, she was a practicing Satanist. And, we were very clear about that. She had become possessed, and that was already known by the priest. They really weren't asking my opinion about whether she was possessed or not, although it quickly became obvious to me that she was possessed. But they wanted me to talk to her. Again, this was pro bono. This was completely voluntary on my part and on her part. She wasn't a patient. When I talk about these individuals, by the way, these are not patients of mine. We can get into that later. Mm-hmm. But they wanted me to talk to Julia because despite the fact that she was possessed and she knew she was possessed, and she wanted to be released from the possession, she wasn't very cooperative with the priest. So sometimes they would schedule an exorcism and she wouldn't show up. So she was clearly ambivalent. So basically, they wanted me to talk to her, as a psychiatrist and someone knowledgeable about psychology. They wanted me to explore with her why she was so ambivalent about getting help, which I did. And I came to meet with her quite a few times. I got to know her very well. She treated me respectfully. In fact, she probably treated me better than she treated the priests that were involved with her. It really was a remarkable case, and that's why I highlighted in the book. Believe it or not, they're going to make a Hollywood movie out of the case. She had an incredibly flamboyant case. She was not only possessed, meaning that from time to time the demon would, put her in a trance and manifest. But in addition, she had, even outside of these possessed states themselves, she had all kinds of psychic powers. And I asked her once, I said, how do you think you got these powers? And she said, well, people think they're gifted, but very few people are gifted. I get these powers from Satan because I worship Satan. So if you think about it, since I met with her quite a few times, I had a very unique opportunity to, witness a case that the experienced priests themselves said was a once-in-a-century case. And number two, she actually gave me permission to write about her as long as I disguised her identity.
Oh, wow.
And I also learned, a fair amount about the satanic cult that she was in. Now, let me emphasize again, as a psychiatrist, I was well aware that there were a lot of false cases
right.
of Satanism and satanic abuse and everything. But she was the real deal. I mean, I had been trained at Yale as a psychiatrist, and I was very aware of what they were calling the satanic panic at the time. In other words, there were a certain amount of people in our culture who were seeing the devil everywhere, who were hearing exaggerated tales. In fact, there were even a couple of people who wrote books about Satanism, and it was essentially totally made up. There are still people who do that. But there are a few of these real Satanist cults, and obviously, Julia, we knew from other evidence she definitely was in a cult, and she sort of told me the lowdown about one of these nefarious, somewhat pathetic cults. I could go on to say a lot about it. Let me just highlight a few points. Sure. When I say that she had these psychic powers of a Satanist, she had amazing powers. She could tell me, including my own mother, who died of ovarian cancer, she could tell me how people died. We call that occult knowledge.
Wow.
She could sometimes exhibit to me what are known by parapsychologists as remote viewing. In other words, she told me she could see some of the exorcists at a distance.
Wow.
So I questioned her, and I challenged her one day. I said, well, I'm not sure I believe you. Can you give me an example? So she was talking about the chief exorcist on the case. There were a couple. And she said, well, I can see him right now. And I said, how are you doing that? She says, well, I see it in what occultists call the third eye. It's like a very vivid picture in my mind. And I said, well, what is he doing? And she said, well, he's walking along a beach, and he's saying I think she said mumbo-jumbo prayers. And I said, what is he wearing? He's wearing a blue windbreaker and his khaki pants. And, I knew he didn't normally say his prayers along a beach. So I was struck by the detail of what she was saying. And I said, well, I'm going to call him. So I called him. I knew him very well by then. He had become a good friend of mine. And I said, Father, what are you doing? And he said, oh, I'm usually at the rectory, but I decided to take a drive and say what's known as the breviary, the daily prayers, say my breviary by walking along the shore of the beach. And I said, what are you wearing? And I remember him saying something to me like, who wants to know? And I said, well, just humor me for a while. And he said, well, I'm wearing a windbreaker. It's blue, and I have my khakis on. Because he used to be in a Marine. So, he had some military pants that he would still wear. Mm-hmm. And then it dawned on him, and he said, oh, Rich, I know what's happening. You're talking to Julia, right? And I said, yeah. And I said, she described me to a T. So there were these different powers that she had, which I write about it in the book.
Yeah.
And then her exorcisms themselves. I've been to about 200 exorcisms in my life. Again, I'm not an exorcist. This was just as an observer,
Yeah.
As a doctor. And I didn't go to her exorcisms, but she had a few. And, I would speak afterwards to all the people, like, 7 or 8 salt of the earth people. And they would tell me what they were like. And she spoke all kinds of foreign languages, including Latin. The room temperature would change, and she would basically go into a trance, and the demonic voice would come out. And then for about a half an hour during the last of the exorcism, she actually levitated. And again, that was vouched for by approximately 8 people who were there. And she did that for about a half an hour. They had to hold her from ascending further. So it was an incredibly dramatic case, which is why, I've written about it in several contexts. And strange to say, careful what you wish for. They're going to make a movie out of that case.
I recall too, reading in your book that she also had this ability to disrupt reality. So in a car ride, you and the priest.
Yeah, that was kind of weird. Yeah. Again, it's been reported, although that's also like a levitation, very rare. Although I've talked to about 35 people in my life. I've never seen one myself who have, who have either experienced or witnessed a levitation in a possessed person. And then there was this bizarre episode where, demons were trying to harass the priest in a car. It turned out they were safe, but they did have a little bit of an accident as this was happening.
Wow.
Very bizarre, very unusual.
Yes.
As is levitation, by the way. I don't think that stuff happens very often, but it just so happens that, I probably have seen and talked to more of these possessed cases than any other physician in the world, maybe any in history, because, there's Zoom and all that nowadays. And, I'm able to consult on people all around the world. So I've had a lot of experience, and, strange to say, about 35 either exorcists or individuals or victims or their families have reported levitation in a possessed individual.
So the book describes her as the queen of this cult group. And what's really gruesome about this, Dr. Gallagher, is she was the one being bred for a sacrifice of her offspring or fetus.
Yeah, well, she always again, I want to emphasize that I don't think this stuff happens a lot, but it has happened. And she was valued by the cult as a breeder. And she would say to me, well, we had an abortionist deliver the fetus, and then we would, do a ritual on the fetus. So she claimed that, this wasn't exactly murdering the baby because it was legal abortion. It sounds, bizarre and strange. These things occasionally happen. Again, they're not rare, and people sometimes exaggerate this kind of thing. But it's not so far from historical reports over many different ancient cultures. I'm a great student of history. I studied classics at Princeton University, and I was very interested in ancient history. And a lot of cultures in history, even though the Greeks and, of course, the ancient Hebrews and Christians condemned it, but a lot of cultures, would sacrifice not just babies, but sometimes children and women, like the Aztecs and like the Carthaginians, hoping to get some, benefit out of it. And that was exactly why Julia became a breeder, because she felt that this is something that would please the cult and please Satan. Unfortunately, the case ended tragically because she refused to cooperate. A lot of people think, well, exorcism is sort of a magic answer, and all you have to do is have an authorized person say the prayers and the devil will be gone. But what they don't realize is that people have to work at it too. So she never wanted to leave the cult. So in a way, it was inevitable that she was not going to be delivered. In a way, she wanted to have her cake and eat it too. In other words, she didn't want to give up her powers. This cult was sort of a strange, bizarre type of family for her. She told me she was in love with the leader. And for all those reasons, she was very reluctant to leave the cult. And I, as well as the priest, would say to her, look, if you don't do that, if you don't renounce Satan, you're never going to be delivered. But she refused to do that. So eventually, she dropped out. A couple of years later, she called me and she told me she was dying. So we presumed she died in that state.
Wow, that's unfortunate.
That's one story, crazy story there. Especially now, are you part of this Hollywood film that's being developed?
Yeah, it's being done by a pretty famous guy named Jason Blum, who does a lot of horror movies and stuff, and he thought it was a fantastic story to tell as a truthful story. Mm-hmm. So I am executive producer.
Oh, nice.
Oh, cool.
It's a little bit careful what you wish for. I hope that they do it.
Really quick.
But it is a dramatic case that lends itself to a movie.
And really quick, Doctor. So when I was in my early teens, I used to listen to the show called Art Bell, and one of his guests on there was Father Martin Malachi. And I believe you had the opportunity to meet him. I just wanted to know.
Father Malachi Martin, right?
Yeah, Malachi Martin. There you go. Sorry like that. Yeah. So when you met him, what did you guys work on or anything like that? I used to listen to him all the time when I was a teen.
Yeah, I actually I knew Art Bell a little bit. He was an interesting character, and I think he was well aware of my work. I guess I was on his show a couple of times, and I also knew a little bit. I mean, I met him a few times. Father Martin. He was not really as experienced an exorcist as a lot of people thought. He kind of was assistant to cases. He was a very scholarly guy. Some people think he took a little liberty with his book. I never really asked him about that. I probably regret not having done that. But, he definitely was an erudite guy who was knowledgeable about the field. And, I did learn some from him, too, at an early point in my experience with these individuals.
Wow. What I find interesting with Julia, the philosophy, according to her, is indulgence instead of abstinence, vital existence instead of spiritual pipe dreams, and vengeance instead of turning the other cheek. That's a dark philosophy there, to say the least.
Well, look, it's very typical of, in a way, paganism, which emphasizes hedonism and indulgence. But it is very typical of somebody who has sort of turned to the dark side. They develop this philosophy that that's what life is all about.
That's very, very interesting. Your book, I actually did it on Audible, and it was great. It was great. I really enjoyed it.
So you got that narrator who,
I did.
As I said, he's a friend of mine. I picked him because he has an incredibly powerful and yet pleasing voice.
Really quick here, Doctor. I want to get into this other person here by the name of Juan in your book, who also I seem to believe who levitated and couldn't even walk into a church. Can we get into him?
Juan, yeah, I don't think Juan. Oh, yes, you're right. Juan did levitate. His wife had reported that to me. That in the bedroom he would be speaking some Latin and levitating. So Juan was a gangster and a pretty successful one because he claimed that he had turned to Satan, to one of these sort of Hispanic death cults. And he was very happy for a while. He told me, well, I have all the money and all the girls I want. Until he got caught, and he got caught by the police, and he was put in prison. And in prison, there was a chaplain who, believed that he was possessed, which he was. And he had some exorcisms in prison. And when he went out, when he left prison, he really did reform his life. But again, that doesn't mean overnight he's going to be fully delivered. So he turned to the church for more exorcisms, and he was eventually delivered. I mean, it shows the contrast, of course, between him and Julia. So Julia never really turned to Christ nor turned to God. So and renounced her evil ways. So she was never delivered. Whereas Juan, did return to his Catholic upbringing in the church, and he worked at reforming his life. By the time I first met him, he was actually a pleasant man, and that, along with again his exorcisms, was what led to a successful outcome.
And he had a buddy with him, right? Speedy. Was it Speedy that mentioned Santa Muerta? And they were in this gang, this big gang that's in LA and Mexico, I guess, or actually the United States.
Yeah, he was a member of Santa Muerte. The
MS-13.
I also referred to the gang MS-13,
Correct.
which is a bunch of often young men who have turned to Satanism of sorts, and I report something in the book that was reported in a New York newspaper, how they would have a circle, and because they were kind of invoking evil, they would often have one of their members would go into a possessed state. Now, again, there's different types of possession. There's possession that is voluntary, as in this case. Most of the cases, we think about are involuntary. A lot of the cases of possession I write about in the book were long-standing cases. But this would be a very temporary, voluntary possession. And they were doing that to gain knowledge about their enemies, this occult knowledge that demons who observe us closely and are very intelligent usually can reveal to human beings under certain rare circumstances. So they did it to get this knowledge about enemies of their crimes. And the guy would go into a trance and, sort of almost go into a type of convulsion, and then a demon would speak through them. Quite tragic in its own way.
Wow. That's this Speedy guy. I was listening to your book.
Yeah, it was Speedy was the guy in the MS cult, and apparently he had gotten disgusted with the cult and he left it, and so there was a New York newspaper person who interviewed him and heard about that story.
Yeah, eerie story. He would say things like, for example, I guess when they go in a trance state, they would look for a soul to take. They would be given a name or something and go take somebody out or punish them. That's
they would be looking for someone that they would harm. It would usually be someone who they thought was antagonistic to their criminal activity.
And I believe a lot of these people who are possessed, as I was saying before, they have some kind of like negative sensation in their body when they walk into a church. Is that true too?
Yeah, there's all kinds of things like that happen with a lot of these cases. They, any clergy that I work with, I've mainly worked with Catholic priests, but I've worked with Protestant ministers and actually clergy of other religions too. And you basically have to have very clear evidence of a foreign spirit. In other words, you have to make a rigorous diagnosis, which many of them are able to do, by the way, but sometimes required to have a medical or a psychiatric opinion. And what essentially you're looking for is something very rigorous as a diagnosis, that there's clear evidence of a foreign spirit. So in addition to some of the things I've talked about already, person going into a trance, a demonic voice coming out of them, something in the realm that is called paranormal, which is often demonic, and it's sort of a pseudoscientific term to what people in the past used to call spiritual or diabolic phenomena. And at the same time, in a lot of these individuals, you'll see something paranormal, like a levitation or speaking foreign languages, revealing hidden knowledge. What is often invariable is that the possessed individual and the demon, when it manifests itself, will be extremely antagonistic or even afraid of holy things.
Oh, okay.
So it may be afraid of religious objects or rosaries or going to church or the mass or something. And, they really are often spouting very anti-Christian remarks about, anything Christian, the cross, the crucifix, whatever.
So,
and sometimes, there are people who will have strange things go on in their house where religious objects or pictures will fall off the wall or something. So clearly you're dealing with a creature that, hates
everything,
religious stuff, but especially hates, Christ and Christianity.
And I have one more question about, because you said you've done this under different religions. And this is just something that I was interested in. Did you see any difference from casting out demons between a Catholic and a Christian? Like, were they successful the same way? Are the rituals the same, etc.?
Well, first of all, I do think that Christian exorcisms in general, Protestant, Catholic, are more effective than non-Christian exorcisms. The Catholic Church, tends to be very organized in the way they say set prayers and that sort of stuff. Although there's also, just sort of commands given to the demon, which is similar to a lot of Protestant churches. There are some denominations in the Protestant denominations that have set prayers, but it's a little more of a spontaneous thing. And a lot of times, some people think that the Catholic Church, which has tremendous experience with this stuff over centuries, might be more experienced at doing this work. But what is quite clear is that, our Lord commissioned his closest followers to have the power to do that.
Amen.
And in the Catholic teaching, it's believed to be passed down in the church.
Wow. The other case I looked at, well, actually, I heard Catherine, a mother, housewife. And what's interesting about her case is she was unable to read scripture or hear things that had to do with the Lord. That is very interesting, to say the least. And she had all three, I believe, pathologies for possession, right?
She was unquestionably possessed too. And again, we're not talking about the cases that, just have mental illness or something, because
right.
there are a fair amount of people who just think they're possessed when they're not. And that's a big part of the work that I do. But Catherine was another person who had gotten involved with some sort of minor satanic stuff. And she became possessed. And the feature of her case that you're referring to is she could hear normally about everything except anything having to do with, the church or religious stuff or our Lord. So it originally manifested itself with questions directed at that. So if you would say to her, Catherine, again, not a real name, but definitely a real case, Catherine, did you go to church? Did you pray today? She couldn't hear you, as opposed to if you said, Catherine, what did you do this morning? Did you go to the store? Something like that. She could answer those questions fine. So I had the bright idea with a fellow psychiatrist of mine. We were both talking to her, and we said, well, why don't we write down the questions, and we'll see if she can answer them that way. And we wrote down a question on a piece of paper and showed it to her. Catherine, what did you buy at the store? And she said, well, I bought dinner, I bought potatoes, whatever. And then we wrote down a question, Catherine, are you losing your faith in our Lord? And she looked at me kind of quizzically and she said, Dr. Gallagher, why are you showing me a blank piece of paper? So selectively, the demons were attacking both her hearing and her sight. And of course, Christians remember that, in the Gospels themselves, there were people who were deaf and all that. And I'm talking about people who, for demonic reasons, had their senses affected. And she was a modern day example of that.
Mm. That's at this point, Doctor, were you even surprised about the things that you experienced after being in this subject in so long? Did you start getting used to this kind of stuff, or did it still surprise you every time?
Well, you do get used to it. I've seen so many of these cases that it never is routine. Yeah. I mean, it's always a little spooky or disconcerting. There was one time, it was early on, it actually had to do with Julia's case where I felt particularly sort of horrified because I was on a conversation with the priest exorcist who had introduced me to the case. And I was talking to him, and he invited me to go to one of her exorcisms. Again, I'm a busy guy with a family and a career as a academic doctor, so I couldn't travel to go to see her exorcism. But while I was talking to this priest on the phone, over the phone, the demonic voice came in over the phone, which was pretty shocking because it kind of underscored for me, gosh, she can even.
What did it sound like?
The demon at least can even invade my telephone line.
Yeah, no kidding.
And I remember it's the only time in my life that literally, I mean, you've heard the expression, the hairs on the back of your neck go up.
Oh, yeah.
Literally, the hairs on the back of my neck went up because it was so kind of disturbing to feel like I was, that demons were coming in on my phone with this priest. I remember his response was, "Oh yes, in a case like this," he heard it too, of course. He said, "In a case like this, of a serious Satanist, even this sort of thing can happen." But again, in the years since, that was early on. I suppose, I have gotten a little calmer about it. These things happen, and it's my job as a doctor, of course, to keep my cool
as much as you can. Do you recall what the voice said?
Well, they tend to repeat themselves a lot. I mean, sometimes there are reports of them saying, strange things that, either reflect on some kind of theological point or something about their identity. But basically, the demon was saying, leave her alone. You'll be sorry. We'll punish her. You effing priest, that sort of thing.
Jesus.
That's very typical language on their part. An interesting case, which I didn't write about in the book, was of a guy who was possessed, and he had what's called a lucid possession. Again, there are these different types of possession. He was unquestionably possessed, and later he was delivered by the church, so he did well. But when he came to my office, he was still possessed, and he had been kind of interested in paganism. He called himself a neo-pagan, one of these modern type of people who sort of have rejected Christianity and gone back to pagan beliefs. And he said to me, I said to him, has the demon told you who's possessing you? And he said, well, there are several. One of them is Zeus.
Oh.
And, I was kind of struck by that because it kind of sounds bizarre, And he said, no, the demon tells me he's Zeus. He says, if you want, Zeus can speak to you. Now, occasionally I will allow a demon to speak if I'm unclear about the case, but normally, people are discouraged from having a conversation with an evil spirit. But he clearly was possessed, and he was possessed by at least one demon who claimed to be Zeus. And obviously it was a demon, it wasn't Zeus, but it underscored for me, and it reminded me of my classical studies, when I was at Princeton, about how so many ancient people felt that they believed in the gods and goddesses, and they often felt that they had to sacrifice to them in ways that, we would regard as similar to getting favors from a demon. And it was actually the ancient Hebrews who, and this is reflected in part in the Bible, but also in what's called the intertestamentary literature, like the Book of Enoch and stuff. They clearly, the Jewish thinkers had clearly figured out, even before Christ, that at least some, albeit sometimes imaginatively elaborated, that some of the deities that they were worshiping, in fact, were demons. And probably the best example of that is, if you're familiar with the story of the Oracle of Delphi. The Oracle of Delphi was a young woman who would go into a trance, and then all this kind of occult knowledge would come out of her, to the extent that people, generals and emperors and, all kinds of people would come to her for this occult knowledge about, their enemies and all that. And basically, this woman, who was usually sort of a local peasant virgin woman, would go into a trance, and then a deeper voice would come out of her, obviously using her vocal cords, but it was a deeper voice, and that voice would claim to be Apollo. So, that shows, in my opinion, pretty unequivocally that the Delphic Oracle, who was famous throughout the ancient world, was in a temporary possession and could allow herself to be temporarily possessed, using these sort of pagan rituals. Getting back to how people would deal with the gods, the baser cultures, and that includes a lot of ancient cultures. It's reflected in a lot of the enemies of the ancient Jews in the Bible. A lot of their enemies would sacrifice all kinds of things, including human beings, to the gods. A number of the Greeks condemned that. For instance, Plato condemned it and said, well, in our civilized culture, that's illegal and unholy. So there were noble pagans too who could recognize that, they had to be careful not to get caught up in occultism.
Right. And this seems like, going back to the Julia being a breeder, for me, this goes back to Molech, passing your children through the fire, the sacrifices. You're right. This goes back to seems like today, these pagan belief systems that are out, New Age, they're all adopting the Near East ancient religions, going back to, like you were speaking on the Old Testament, when they were dealing with the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, all these different tribes that were, and it's also in the Quran. I was listening to your online book, and, the spirits, they call them the jinns, and the fallen heroes, back in the biblical times, are known today as the historical Nephilim,
the giants,
disembodied spirits of the Nephilim. And today now, Dr. Gallagher, I'm sure you're aware, more and more people are getting to the Ouija board. There's a Christian board now, I guess, and people speaking into spirit boxes, claiming they're speaking to their lost loved ones. And it's getting a bigger following now, especially Wicca, witches, brujos, brujas.
Well, really quick, Dr. Gallagher, when I went to go pick up your book at Barnes & Nobles, let me tell you, the witchcraft section and the spell book section is a lot bigger than the theology section. Way bigger. We got tarot cards, like my father said, Ouija boards, Wicca, Wiccan, all kinds of stuff that I saw. I even saw the Bible of Aleister Crowley there. I mean, there's way more of those books than there is of anything on Christianity.
Well, yeah, you're exactly right. And Moloch was one of these many ancient gods that people would do child sacrifice to. And a lot of things like modern spiritualism and channeling spirits that has reemerged in modern times is very reflective of these ancient pagan practices that were condemned in the Bible. I mean, for instance, in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, summoning spirits is regarded as an abomination. So you're right. There is a kind of reemergence of some of this. I mean, some of this stuff over the centuries was always found in non-Christian cultures, and even in Christian cultures was sort of hidden. But, in sort of secret societies and stuff like that. But, I think you're both right that in today's world, we're seeing an unfortunate reemergence of some of the dark elements of paganism.
Why do you think that it is, Dr. Gallagher? Is it partly, could it be histrionic behaviors, dissociative identity disorders, compulsory disorders? What's the cause? Is it more people are seeking something to say, look at me, I can do this, or I have this? What, in your experience, what can you, in your opinion, come to some kind of conclusion on that? Why are people turning to this more and more people, especially young people, are turning to gain these powers from the demons?
Well, you do have to be careful about, interpreting all sorts of, eating disorders and stuff as demonic. I mean, people are hurting.
Right.
And there is a way in which, if a society, becomes less Christian, they're going to turn to other sources of pleasure in their life or behavior that, is destructive. And so I think that a certain amount of, pathological behavior, certainly things like suicide, is a reflection how once people, lose their connection with our Lord and a sensible religion, these things inevitably emerge. I do think and again, I don't think we're the only age in history that has had that happen, but, we are in Western civilization, in Western societies, seeing a lot of pathology emerge, some of which is somewhat demonic. It's interesting at the same time, for instance, in Africa, which was 100 years ago, 10% Christian is over 50% Christian now. So, things in some areas of the world decline, and in other areas of the world, Christianity is growing. So, look, we hope for the future. We keep our Christian optimism and joy, whatever happens, because we know it's in God's hands. And number two, ultimately, we know Christ is the victor.